Hey, everybody. Welcome to Red May and to our presentation this afternoon, Who Can Be Defended? The Emancipatory Power of the Palestinian Revolution, given by Jodi Dean, professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith College, a frequent guest at Red May, the author of books such as Blog Theory, Aliens in America, the Communist Trilogy, the Communist Horizon, Crowds and Party, and Comrade, the recent Organize, Fight, and Win, co-authored with another Red May star, Charisse Burden-Stelly. We're always happy to have Jodi back. She's going to give her talk, and then to amplify it and give it a sort of international dimension, we will have Enzo Rossi, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam, and Matthew Tsimitakis, who is a journalist in various Greek media. So we get the global view. So let's start with Jodi, and then we will cut back and have discussion after the presentations.
Thanks so much, Philip. I'm really happy to be back with Red May, and I'm also really happy to be here with my friends and comrades, Matthew and Enzo. I want to start, though, by noting that today, May 15th, is Nakba Day, right, marking the violent expulsion and displacement of Palestinians from their land. And as we know, the Nakba is ongoing. The catastrophe doesn't end. For the last 8 months, the world has watched the US and Israel wage a brutal war of extermination against the Palestinian people. At this point, over 35,000 Gazans are dead. Hundreds have been killed in the West Bank by settlers and the IDF. As South Africa demonstrated before the International Court of Justice, Israel's genocidal intent has been clear, not only in words, but in actions. Cut off water, food, fuel, and electricity. Bomb hospitals, mosques, universities, refugee camps, apartment buildings. Announced the goal of wiping out Hamas while saying that everyone is Hamas. Children are Hamas. South Africa is a legal arm of Hamas. UNRWA aid workers are Hamas, and so on. Like just this past week, Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir wrote on Twitter that Hamas heart Biden. Not quite the same thing, but exemplary of the crazy expansion and use of the word Hamas in an effort to stigmatize anything it touches. The kernel of truth in imperialist and Zionist propaganda is that Hamas is the leader of the Palestinian resistance, recognized as such in Palestine and throughout the global South. Winning democratic elections in the Palestinian Authority in 2006, Hamas has a large youth and social services wing, as well as a military force, the Al-Qassam Brigades. Its military is the leading group in the broader Palestinian Joint Operations Room, comprising armed groups from multiple factions, socialist as well as Islamist and nationalist. Hamas understands itself as, quote, a Palestinian Islamic national liberation and resistance movement, end quote. It presents the Palestinian cause as, quote, the cause of an occupied land and a displaced people, end quote. Paragraph 16 of its 2017 political charter states, Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine, end quote. Hamas advocates rebuilding the PLO on democratic foundations. And it views the liberation of Palestine as the duty of all Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, and humanitarians in general. As Tariq Bakoni notes, Hamas, quote, does not tolerate any form of ideologies that are committed to violence for the sake of violence or the transnational violence that we see in organizations like ISIS or otherwise, end quote. On the one hand, Hamas rejects all agreements and settlements that undermine the rights of the Palestinian people. On the other, it considers, quote, the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June, 1967, with the return of the refugees and the displaced to their homes from which they were expelled, to be a formula of national consensus, end quote. Responding to a question regarding Hamas's 2006 electoral victory, Bocconi explains, quote again, Hamas's resistance project then and now is still something that Palestinians admire and appreciate because they see it as protecting them from Israeli force, end quote. Throughout the first half of 2024, right in the last few months, officials from Hamas and Fatah have met in Russia and China for reconciliation talks aimed toward the possible building of a unity government. China, in particular, sees, quote, Hamas as a legitimate political force in Palestine's future and statehood, end quote. And this is a view grounded in China's own historical experience of armed struggle, as well as in international law. So I began with the last 8 months of the US and Israel's devastating genocide in Gaza. In addition to these horrors, though, we've also seen a global outpouring of solidarity. Millions in the streets, every Friday, 1 million in Yemen alone. Marches, demonstrations, and solidarity encampments all over the world. Multiple countries have recalled their ambassadors from Israel. They've introduced ceasefire resolutions in the UN Security Council, only to have them vetoed by the US. And despite US efforts, on May 10th, the UN voted by a wide margin, 143-9 with 25 abstentions. It voted by wide margin to expand Palestine's rights and privileges as an observer state, pushing the Security Council to reconsider Palestine's request for full membership, even as the US and Israel consistently thwart its state project. What's striking then, and what's undeniable, is the clear division in the world. On the one side, the masses of people supporting Palestine, and on the other, the US, Israel, and their junior partners in the imperialist core. The current global uprising for Palestine is reminiscent of the 1970s and 1980s, when there were strong alliances among various national liberation struggles. By the end of the 70s, Edward Said tells us, quote, there was not a progressive political cause that did not identify with the Palestinian movement, end quote. Solidarity with Palestine united the left, knitting liberation struggles together in a global anti-imperialist front. Historian Robin D.G. Kelly says, quote, we radicals regarded the PLO as a vanguard in a global third world struggle for self-determination, traveling along a non-capitalist road to development. Palestine stood on the front lines in a protracted battle against imperialism and settler capitalism. Palestinians weren't victims, at least not in my political world. They were revolutionary combatants and thus models for those of us dedicated to Black liberation and socialism, end quote. One of the ways that US imperialism tries to quell support for liberation struggles is by designating the groups that lead them as terrorists. A well-known example is the ANC, right? Nelson Mandela's anti-apartheid organization that the US labeled terrorist. In 1996, the US passed the Antiterrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, making material support for terrorism a crime. It became illegal to give money or other material support to any liberation struggle or state that the US doesn't like Cuba, Iran, Syria, and Korea. As everybody knows, the US considers Hamas a terrorist organization. The United Nations does not, nor do Russia, China, South Africa, Norway, Brazil, India, Turkey, and the Philippines, to name a few, while Canada, Australia, the UK, and the EU are among those who do. A clear effect of US anti-terrorism is the delegitimation and even criminalization of liberation struggles. Revolutionaries defending people's rights of self-determination, rights to resist occupation and aggression, rights to resist occupation and oppression are demonized. Anyone who says a word in their behalf is condemned. That's why we've had to insist every day at every march that resistance is not terrorism. US imperialism's dictates regarding who and what can be defended are the context in which humanitarian aid work comes to substitute for militant political organization, management for struggle, and NGOs and CSOs for revolutionary parties. What looks like depoliticization is actually imperialist state power, the power of capitalists as a class to structure the world so that they can profit. Humanitarianism is one of the masks they use to hold this in place, because who could be against humanitarianism? Sarah Roy writes compellingly about Israel's deliberate transformation of Gaza into a humanitarian problem as a means of managing the underlying political issue. Economic, environmental, and infrastructural devastation push survival questions to the fore, forever postponing the political question of Palestinian statehood. Institutionalized humanitarian assistance then normalizes occupation. Most of the images of Palestinians that we in the US see depict devastation, bereavement, and death. Palestinians' humanity is made conditional on their suffering. On the one hand, this helps counter racist presentations of terrorists and animals. On the other hand, the dominance of the image of the victim produces the good Palestinian as a civilian, even better as a woman or child. Those who fight back, especially as part of organized groups, are condemned, and the rest of us are required to join in this condemnation. Defending Hamas is forbidden because Palestinian national liberation has been repressed as a political project. Mainstream media in the imperialist core, in keeping with Zionist and imperialist state practice, insists that any mention of Hamas or the genocidal assault Israel is waging on Gaza, it insists that this begin with condemnation. Condemnation of Hamas is a condition for speaking, and this has been going on for decades. Tarek Bakoni describes watching news programs in 2014 when Israel was demolishing Gaza in Operation Protective Edge. Palestinian analysts were rudely silenced on the air for failing to condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization outright. Today, everyone is expected to speak as a state, to conduct themselves as representatives of a state, conditioned to act in accordance with the practices deemed acceptable to the imperialist world order. The form of interaction is established in advance as norms of permissible speech. These norms are backed by the coercive power of public and private institutions, as anti-terrorist legislation and ever-expanding definitions of anti-Semitism penalize support for Palestinian liberation. Recall, in December, the US House of Representatives passed a resolution declaring that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. They recently passed the bill HR 6090, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, that uses the definition of anti-Semitism from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to define what counts as prohibited discrimination in educational institutions. It's kind of weird, but noteworthy that the bill refers to the definition, but it actually doesn't repeat or quote it. The IHRA definition says that comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to Nazis is anti-Semitic, as is the claim that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Rather than championing revolutionary combatants as models for liberation, and socialism, which Robin Kelly reminded us was part of the radical politics of the 70s and 80s, multiple ostensibly progressive voices conform to imperialist expectations, conceding to the conditions for acceptable speech. We have seen this in the multiple condemnations of October 7th, even from people calling for a ceasefire and an end to the occupation. But this isn't surprising. Those who fail to concede the injunction to condemn are canceled. And there are multiple examples of this. I'm going to give one. On October 19th, an open letter signed by thousands in the arts community was published on the Art Forum website. It said, "We support Palestinian liberation and call for an end to the killing and harming of all civilians, an immediate ceasefire, the passage of humanitarian aid into Gaza, and the end of the complicity of our governing bodies in grave human rights violations and war crimes. We demand that the institutional silence around the ongoing humanitarian crisis that 2.3 million Palestinians are facing in the occupied and besieged Gaza Strip be broken immediately. In the words of the UN resident humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, it's about the loss of our humanity if the international community allows this to continue. What we are seeing now is simply inhumane." So that's in quote. So that's the statement that was published as an open letter in Art Forum. And it's not particularly radical. It does not call for an end to the siege and occupation. It does not call for the release of all Palestinian political prisoners or an end to US support for Israel. It calls for a ceasefire and an end to the killing and harming of civilians and an end to institutional silence. It's a compelling statement grounded in common humanity and an appeal to human rights. The letter does not condemn the October 7th attack. It affirms the value of civilian life and supports Palestinian liberation. Now, this letter, this open letter from the arts community met with immediate pushback. Gallery owner Marianne Boesky, she's the daughter of the infamous Ivan Boesky from the insider trading scandals of the mid-'80s, and who was actually the basis for Michael Douglas's character Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street. So anyway, this daughter, gallery owner Marianne Boesky, she was upset that an ad for her gallery appeared in the same space as the artist letter. She said that the statement violated the rule that you must condemn Hamas before you can support any Palestinian base from being killed, end quote. Peter Doig, an artist who initially signed the letter, removed his name from the statement because, quote, it lacked an explicit mention of the Hamas attack. The editor-in-chief of Art Forum, David Velasco, was fired for publishing the letter. And subsequently, another letter from the art world circulated, criticizing the uninformed initial letter and calling for unity in opposition to terrorism and advocacy for humanity. The second letter foregrounded the terrorist organization Hamas as committing an act that resulted in the single deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. It urged empathy for all innocent civilians, including Palestinians tragically affected by the heinous actions of Hamas, end quote. My view is that it's a failure of solidarity to condemn the fight back of a people who have been violently dispossessed, rendered permanent refugees, occupied, under siege for 17 years, subject to repeated and arbitrary attack and imprisonment, and so on. And we need to keep in mind that the violent use of force is not always condemned. It's celebrated when the oppressors do it, honored when carried out by state power, right, by the state that wins. We've seen this recently in the US when South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham has had this unhinged suggestion that Israel should be treating Hamas the way the US treated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. More in a more sane, sort of more sane discussion in the history of political ideas, military prowess and the capacity to bear arms has long been glorified, understood as the very condition for citizenship in a republic. The political theorist Corey Robin recently reminded us of W.E.B. Du Bois's discussion in Black Reconstruction in America. Du Bois quotes Abraham Lincoln speaking to Black troops. If those that claim to be your superiors do not know you are free, take the sword and bayonet and teach them that you are, end quote. When we accept condemnation of armed struggle as the condition for speaking, we rule out in advance the capacity to support or defend colonized, occupied, and oppressed people when they stand up in their own self-defense. The political horizon that united progressive forces at the end of the 70s disappears. Oppressed people fight back against their oppressors by whatever means they can. They choose, and they're forced to choose by the settings in which their liberation struggles take place. They choose the strategies and tactics they need to win. Will the oppressor be persuaded by strong arguments? Will the oppressor tolerate critique and dissent? How dependent is the oppressor on the compliance of the oppressed? How much moral condemnation is the oppressor willing to absorb? How much force will the oppressor use to quash rebellion? To recognize the right to resist an oppressor, the right to national self-determination, means defending those willing and able to fight back against their oppressors, knowing that they are constantly raising and answering such questions. It's not the same thing as advocating or encouraging violence. It's the defense of an occupied people's resistance to occupation. The point is respect for and solidarity with those carrying out the struggle. And of course, defense need not be uncritical. Individuals, groups, and states often find themselves in the political position of defending those with whom they disagree. But there are better and worse times to raise criticisms and different kinds of criticisms. What really matters is that defense has to take its orientation from the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, not from the imperialist order that enables and validates oppression. Solidarity has to rise out of has to arise out of commonalities of resistance rather than commonalities of oppression, to use Robin Kelly's formulation. And this idea isn't new. It has a long history in struggles for national liberation and self-determination. We're currently living in just a completely strange and upside down world where the provision of billions of dollars in weapons to carry out a genocide is acceptable, but words of support for those resisting a genocide or protesting against a genocide are not. Imperialist institutions, from the state to the university, try to control what we can support, what we can say, and what we can feel. The terrorist designation and the dramatic expansion of the definition of anti-Semitism, the emphasis on humanitarianism over politics, and the requirement that we condemn Hamas are all ways that imperialist institutions attempt to repress solidarity with Palestine. Over the last few weeks, just as we have witnessed the courage of university students as they've established Gaza solidarity encampments, we've also seen university administrators calling in police to violently shut them down. Students and faculty have been suspended and arrested, often brutally. University presidents claim to be concerned with safety, yet they authorize snipers on the roofs of campus buildings and send massive numbers of police in, like invading troops. Universities present themselves as combating discrimination when what they're really doing is trying to protect themselves from lawsuits and investigations and keep donors happy. They suppress student groups, enforce absurd regulations, outlaw BDS, and restrict slogans. Slogans are taken to be acts of violence, missiles launched into a crowd where no one can flee to safety. And none of this is neutral. The constriction of politics to the fake moral precepts of campus security is another moment in the systematic attempt to buttress imperial power. Restrictions on what we can say and how we can say it aim to redirect feeling and outrage away from apartheid, occupation, and blockade. They police and attempt to control the affective environment enabling genocide. Feelings deemed inappropriate are met with disgust and condemned. Progressives who should know better start demanding that the slogans be revised. Don't say there is only one solution, intifada revolution, because some people are uncomfortable with the word intifada and others don't like the expression one solution. Don't even say free Palestine, because it can be interpreted in different ways. There are alternatives that could make everyone comfortable and kind of lower the temperature on the resistance to genocide. The policing of feeling and regulation of affect drove events at Cornell in October. Russell Rickford, a professor of African American history, was condemned for calling the October 7th attack energizing and exhilarating. And he said this in the context of a speech where he talked about the appalling nature of violence. But yet, Cornell's president and chair of its board of trustees issued a statement calling his remarks reprehensible, and a petition demanding that he be fired garnered nearly 12,000 signatures. What he was saying, though, wasn't false. For many around the world, the images of paragliders evading Israeli air defenses were exhilarating. They showed a brief moment of freedom, freedom from walls and from the expectations of submission to occupation and siege. We witnessed seemingly impossible acts of bravery and defiance in the face of knowledge of the devastation that would follow. I mean, that Israel practices asymmetric warfare and responds with disproportionate force is no secret, least of all to Palestinians. For a brief instance, we saw oppressed people taking to the skies in escape and soaring in momentary freedom. The shattering of the collective sense of what is possible made it seem as if anyone could be free, as if imperialism, occupation, and oppression can and will be overthrown. In her autobiography, Leila Khaled reflects on a successful hijacking. Quote, "It seemed the more spectacular the action, the better the morale of our people," end quote. Spectacular actions puncture expectations and create a new sense of possibility, liberating people from hopelessness and despair. When we witness such actions, many of us also feel this sense of openness, our response indicative of the subject effect the actions unleash. Something in the world has changed because a subject has inscribed a gap in the given. We see the action as caused by a subject, producing that subject as its retroactive effect. And that's an idea from Hélène Badiou. Imperialism tries to shut these feelings down before they can spread too far. It condemns them and declares them off limits. So controlling speech and feeling is part of a political struggle. Anything that ignites the feeling that the oppressed will break free, that occupations and blockades will end, this has to be extinguished. Imperialists and Zionists reduce October 7th to a list of horrors, not simply to block from view the history and reality of colonialism, occupation, and siege. They do it to prevent the gap of the disruption from producing the subject that caused it. As part of the struggle over what we can feel, I've assembled an affective carousel that takes the energies and feelings that Zionism and imperialism attempt to foreclose, and that uses these to force a gap in our sense of permissible feeling. I emphasize flight, taking to the skies, the exhilaration of transcendence. Images associated with flying can incite solidarity with the freedom struggle, with the hope and the will to win. If they can escape, and they must escape, so can we all. The first intifada was precipitated by the Night of the Gliders. On November 25th and 26th in 1987, two Palestinian guerrilla fighters from the PFLP-GC, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, they landed in Israeli-occupied territory. They were on gliders. Both were killed. One killed 6 and injured 7 Israeli soldiers before he died. Palestinians made the guerrilla a national hero. Folks in Gaza wrote 6-1 on their walls in order to taunt the IDF troops. PLO chairman Yasser Arafat praised the fighters, quote, "The attack demonstrated that there could be no barriers or obstacles to prevent a guerrilla who has decided to become a martyr," end quote. In 2018, during the Great March of Return, Gazans used kites and balloons to evade Israeli air defenses and start fires in Israeli territory. It seems as if Palestinian youth first started sending the fire kites, and then Hamas got involved and created the Al-Zawahiri unit that specialized in making and launching incendiary kites and balloons. They also inflated condoms and sent those flying over the fence. The kites and balloons boosted morale in Gaza while damaging the Israeli economy and irritating Israelis living near the Gaza border. In response to an Italian journalist's remarks about the iconic new weapon that was driving Israel crazy, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar explained, "Kites are not a weapon. At most, they set on fire some stubble, an extinguisher, and it's over. They're not a weapon, they're a message. Because they are just twine and paper and an oil-soaked rag, while each battery of the Iron Dome cost $100 million. Those kites say, you are immensely more powerful, but you will never win. Really, never." There's further context for reading kites in Gaza as messages from a people that refuses to submit. In 2011, 15,000 Palestinian children on a Gaza beach broke the world record for the most kites flown at the same time. Many of the kites featured Palestinian flags and symbols, as well as wishes for peace and hope. An 11-year-old, Rawia, who made her kite the Palestinian flag, said, "When I fly it, I feel like I'm raising my country and my flag up in the sky." The 2013 documentary Flying Paper, directed by Nitin Sawhney and Roger Hill, tells the story of some young kite flyers. Quote, "When we fly kites, we feel like we are the ones flying in the sky. We feel that we have freedom, that there is no siege on Gaza. When we fly the kite, we know that freedom exists," end quote. Earlier this year, kites and solidarity demonstrations took place around the world, and they seem to be continuing to take place, expressing and amplifying a hope and a will for Palestinian freedom. As is now well known, and rightly so, universally well known, Rafat Al-Harir's last poem, "If I Must Die," draws on the association of kites and hope. Here's the poem. "If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a story." The kite is a message of love. It's something made to fly, and in flying create hope. Al-Arir's words attend to the making of the kite, its crafting out of cloth and strings, as well as its flight. Making the kite is more than mourning. It's an engagement in practical optimism, an element of the subjective process that establishes the subject of a politics, the you instructed to make the kite and tell the story. One last example of the practical optimism that flight engenders is Yasser Arafat International Airport. Palestinians built it in 1998. Israeli bulldozers demolished it in 2001 during the Second Intifada. Hind Qadari explains that the airport was deeply interconnected with the dream of Palestinian statehood. She interviewed workers who built the runway that's been reduced to rubble and sand. Qadari writes, Gaza Airport was more than a project. It was a symbol of freedom for Palestinians. Flying the Palestinian flag in the sky was the dream of every Palestinian, end quote. The paragliders who flew into Israel on October 7th continue the Revolutionary Association of Liberation and Flight. Although imperialist and Zionist forces try to condense the action onto a singular figure of Hamas terrorism, insisting against all evidence to the contrary that with the extermination of Hamas, Palestinian resistance will disappear, the will to fight for Palestinian freedom precedes and exceeds Hamas. Hamas wasn't the subject of the October 7th action. It was an agent hoping that the subject would emerge as an effect of its action, the latest instantiation of the Palestinian revolution. Words used by Leila Khaled to defend the justness of the PFLP's hijacking tactic apply equally well to October 7th. Khaled writes, as a comrade has said, we act heroically in a cowardly world to prove that the enemy is not invincible. We act violently in order to blow the wax out of the ears of the deaf Western liberals and to remove the straws that block their vision. We act as revolutionaries to inspire the masses and to trigger off the revolutionary upheaval in an era of counter-revolution, end quote. How can an oppressed people believe that change is possible? How can movements that have experienced decades of defeat ever feel like our fights are winnable? Sarah Roy documented the despair pervading Gaza and the West Bank prior to October 7th. Factionalism, in the sense that not just Fatah but Hamas as well was cooperating too much with Israel, had unraveled confidence in any national unifying project. A friend told Roy, our past demands have become meaningless. No one speaks of Jerusalem or the right of return. We just want food security and open crossings, end quote. Al-Aqsa flood attacked that despair. The coalition of resistance fighters refused to accept defeat and submit to the indignity of slow death. Their action was designed so that the revolutionary subject would appear as its effect. To conclude, I've talked about the ways that imperialist institutions try to repress Palestinian solidarity and the revolutionary subject by policing what we can support, say, and feel. I've used images of flight to evoke a different structure of feeling, one that takes its lead from the Palestinian freedom struggle. As PFLP co-founder Ghassan Kafani said, the Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, wherever they are, as a cause of the exploited and oppressed masses in our era. Some universities have banned from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. There's even been a national and international debate over the slogan, another part of the war on feeling, solidarity with Palestine, and extinguishing the subjective process October 7th ignited. But what the imperialists should really get upset about is the slogan, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. This slogan rejects fragmentation and recognizes the anti-imperialist subject as an effect of the Palestinian cause. It replaces humanitarian management with an insistence on freedom. Taking the side of the Palestinian resistance, one responds to a revolutionary subject, the subject fighting against apartheid and occupation. Which side are you on? Palestine names a side in the struggle against imperialism. When the Palestinian resistance dramatically punctures its setting of occupation and oppression, the fact of this side reemerges. It confronts an order that wants to exterminate it with the fact of a continued will to persist, to redress injustice, to reclaim what has been taken, and to be recognized as a people, a nation, a state with a right of self-determination. As they take up their duty to oppose occupation and genocide, millions of people around the world then become the revolutionary subject that will ensure Palestine will be free. So I look forward to hearing now from Matthew and then Enzo. Matthew, can you unmute?
Right, sorry. So now you can hear me, right? Okay. I think that was a necessary, like, small gap between this fascinating speech that we just heard and this amazing talk. And I was saying that it's a bit hard to continue from where you left, and so I'll just try to add a few images, a few points that maybe just make a few bold lines, but I'm not sure I can add too much to what you said. And I remembered as you were speaking, the first time I went to Palestine, like in my 25 years in journalism and communications, like I did go to Palestine only 2 months after Ariel Sharon entered Temple Mosque and the second Intifada started. And I very vividly remember the moment we had to cross the Erez checkpoint, which is the main entrance to Gaza from Israel. And what was striking about that moment was that to go from Israel to Gaza, we had to cross a special economic zone, an industrial zone, where Palestinians had to go and work every day under guns, under Israeli soldiers, to make a living that was basically of very bad quality, and to depend their everyday lives, their water, their food, their electricity, their schools, everything on Israel. And yeah, as I was hearing you talk, listening to you talking, I remember that we don't really understand what apartheid means in this case. So that was the first image, that basically apartheid means that your whole life depends on what is essentially your enemy, the occupying force. I mean, the few days that we spent there, we did see squads abducting people, kids being arrested, soldiers firing at people, the electricity going, all of what we see now like, of course, in a much bigger extent now, even in the West Bank, where supposedly things are not, where supposedly the area is not in war. The second image was that, like years later, I happened to go to Beersheba, which is like the military industrial city of Israel, where high technology, American high technology companies are producing software, technological products. And that was striking as well, because when you realize that basically these entities work together, and then there were spin-offs coming from the IDF, small companies, startups that produce spyware that undermine democracies in so many countries all over the world, my country included, Greece. I mean, there's the story of the Predator spyware, but also Pakistan, South Sudan, Sudan, so many countries. So that's the second image in contrast. The third image is that I try to imagine like a Palestinian who flees Gaza and becomes a refugee. And for the first time, I think, like in my lifetime, this is an impossible task. If somebody managed to flee Gaza, say go to Turkey, get on a boat, and try to cross the Aegean, they would most likely die in the sea. So, I mean, I think that we're coming to a moment where what you just said, that neoliberalism, this moment in history has reduced us to subjects that cannot imagine being liberated or imagining socialism. Something that we did imagine until the 90s is starting to articulate again. I mean, now we know after the ICJ court, where Namibia and Nicaragua took Germany to court, we know that these are the countries who are selling, the US, Germany, are selling the weapons that Israel is using to kill innocent Palestinians. Israel is exporting the spyware that is undermining our democracies. The people who are massively on the streets now, and we have to admit that this is the most important movement we have seen after 1990. I don't remember like any other movement that was global, everywhere in the world, saying the same thing. I mean, we have seen uprisings back in the 2010, 2011, 2012, the so-called like waves of uprisings, mainly in the Arab world, but also in Europe. But they never managed to organize to a level. I mean, they did exchange symbols, messages, they did articulate discourses, but they never managed to organize up to a level that could potentially form a narrative, but can be liberating for all of us everywhere. So these are the main points. And then I was thinking about, I mean, look, Israel is a military powerhouse. It's a military machine, like one of the strongest militaries in the world. It doesn't only brag about the fact that it's a military machine, but it also undermines democracies all over the world. And yet, these people with nothing, just by deciding to wage an impossible war, because the war that the Hamas is waging against Israel is impossible. It cannot be won, and it can also not be lost, because it's not happening on the military. It's not on the military field. It's happening on the moral field. So the more Palestinians are dying in this war, the more are going to enter in the resistance, because no matter what one might think about what Hamas is, the young Palestinians who will join the Hamas forces are resistant fighters. The moral, cultural defeat of Israel, and along with Israel, the power formation that is supporting it, the hegemonic formation that is supporting the Israeli government, and essentially far-right government. I mean, we've seen it all over the West. In my pieces, also in my cultural website that I'm editing, but also in my pieces for Al Jazeera, I try to track down, like, as you mentioned, all of the different stories of the suppression of the freedom of speech in Europe. And if you see the list, it's endless. It starts somewhere in November, and it never stopped. Whether we're talking about Documenta, like the most important post-Second World War art exhibition in Germany, like an institution that essentially shapes the modern German culture. Whether we're talking about the Biennale in Venice, all of them have been suppressed one way or another. And we even got to the ridiculous point of the Eurovision, like a kitsch TV event, where the EBU changed the sound so that the booing of the crowd inside the event would not be heard. So these are symbolic gestures that are important, because I think they do express a fear by what is, in essence, the establishment, the political establishment, about the possibility that all these different stories will eventually do come together and articulate a common goal, and that, to my understanding, would be political, and it would talk again about the need for peace and the need for socialism, which is what we have forgotten to talk about. So I'm not sure I can add anything more. I'll be happy to discuss later, but thank you very much. Yeah, with that, just one line to pass it to Enzo. It's my daughter is studying in Amsterdam, and I was, yeah. So, and of course, just to mention that, to make a bridge to Enzo, I do hear from my fellow friends in Berlin, like how they're being accused and hunted down by the police and so on. But what we're seeing in Amsterdam is insane.
Yes.
The police violence is not even in Greece. I mean, Greece has a tradition of like very tough conflicts. Not even in Greece. Like, and I guess it's not by accident that Geert Wilders announced earlier today that the far right is indeed forming another government in Europe.
Yes.
So, yeah, thanks. I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. That's a very, and thank you, Jodi, and thank you all for having me. I think that's a very good bridge to the situation. I mean, I am in a torn position here because on the one hand, I understand a part of my role here is also to talk to an audience that's primarily in the United States about perceptions in Europe. On the other hand, we have the imperative of keeping our eyes where the action is, where the problem is, and so I am a little bit torn. And there's another factor to my being torn here. I take it one of the main reasons for me being here is also to talk about issues around academic freedom and freedom of speech. And I can tell you a story about that very soon, but I would want to do that while keeping our eyes on the prize, if that's not an inappropriate way of thinking about this. Now, I'll cycle back to the repression in Amsterdam, which has in fact been something to behold. I was, well, doesn't matter in any case. But look, I want to sort of go back to Jodi's initial talk today. Now, I imagine people will have many different reactions to it. They might agree with all of it, some of it, none of it. It doesn't really matter to some extent. What I wanted to point out is something that Jodi is too focused on the politics of the situation and where the drama and the genocide is to talk about, namely to talk about herself. Because what you should know is that Jodi has been suspended from her teaching position at Howard and William Smith colleges, and it still is suspended, as I understand, for publishing a blog post that contained, by and large, the same argument, an argument very similar to the one that we just heard today. And here, I think it's worth pointing out something quite peculiar. In Europe, we always say that there is much more freedom of speech in the United States because there is the First Amendment and there are private universities that are and many other private institutions that are less bound by all kinds of straight regulations and this and that. And we complain about this in Europe. We often wish that we had this kind of freedom of speech. But there is a somewhat paradoxical situation. It's in the end not a paradox at all. There's a very simple explanation for it. The Israel lobby, the Israeli interests in the US are so powerful that very often these freedoms that are guaranteed from the constitutional level all the way to sort of all kinds of sort of lesser levels of norms become in effect vacuous. They become sort of empty words. Because think again of what happened to Jodi. It's entirely blatantly obvious that her speech in that situation is protected. It's extramural speech protected by the First Amendment. And there is also an issue of academic freedom. You can't have academics being disciplined, fired, sanctioned in any way for their speech. And especially in this case, which is speech that relates to Jodi's own field, of course, which is politics, right? Now, and yet, all these supposedly sort of rock solid liberal freedoms, they sort of crumble in the face of the power of donors, of a sort of concerted set of interests that is able to ride roughshod over, liberties that ordinary American citizens just take for granted. And that's something that I think is worth pointing out, because there is an ability sometimes of people to ignore events as tragic and dramatic and political as a genocide, because they think that this has no impact on their ways of going about their daily lives. But I think a case like Jodi's, and there are many other cases of academics such as the other ones that she mentioned, they are cases that show that the fragility, in some cases you might even want to say the shallowness, hollowness rather, of basic liberal freedoms that we take for granted. There is almost a sort of there's a moment in which, when certain interests, you want to call it empire, call it whatever you want, call it capital, call it whatever you want. When certain interests are threatened, the gloves come off. There's another level, as it were, of the order which supposedly provides certain freedoms. There's often a story that people tell that say that fascism is liberalism's plan B. When you have a successful movement of resistance of any kind, typically it would be a case of a successful labor movement inside capitalist economies, liberals are prepared to sacrifice at least some of their freedom, of course not property, not the right to private property, but many of their other freedoms, so as to block emancipatory forces, right? And I think this is something of what we are witnessing here, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe. And this is something that you can say, again, regardless, and I'm making no claims to this effect here, but regardless of what you think about the details of the argument that we just heard from Jodi, the general perception is that certain taboos have been violated about the kinds of things that one is allowed to say, even though in theory, especially in the United States, one is allowed to say just about anything, right? But then there are some special circumstances, as it were, when all of that smoke screen sort of dissipates, and that is what we are witnessing now. And I guess the message that I'm trying to convey here is quite simply that it is imprudent. It is not wise to take one's liberal freedoms for granted in circumstances of significant political upheaval, such as the ones that we are witnessing here, right? And that's, I think, is something that almost anyone in our audience should be able to relate to their daily lives. And now I think I can move on to say just a few things about the situation here in Europe, and Matthew has already told you something. I was saying at the beginning that we have much less permissive laws and regulations about speech, and this is, of course, partly to do with the history of fascism in Western Europe that has made many people, if you ask me in a misplaced way, sort of nervous about free speech. It strikes me that the Nazis didn't particularly need free speech to make the points that they wanted to make, and in fact, they started saying what they really meant quite late in the day. They seized power anyway. But in any case, this is a view that has been taken by European governments traditionally. Nonetheless, it seems to me that despite this less permissive legal framework, when it comes to academic freedom and such like, we have seen less repression, I should say, than we have seen in the United States. Fewer calls for academics, fewer sort of credible calls for academics to be fired. I get people saying that they should be fired on Twitter all the time, but this is just powerless, anonymous idiots. But we have seen fewer sort of credible threats for academics to be fired and other sort of people in similar roles. And this is interesting because, again, it goes to show that there is a discrepancy between the letter of liberal rights and the actual power relations that may or may not underpin them. Nonetheless, and this is not to say that there has not been significant levels of repression. The case of Germany is maybe the one that is, and Matthew was talking about, is really the most extreme. I think there is a bizarre convergence of forces. You have the European far right that seems to have decided that for the 21st century, they think that Islamophobia is more important than anti-Semitism. They now, they hate Muslims more than they traditionally always hated Jews. They are using the sort of excuse of sort of a largely misperceived anti-Semitism to go after the European Muslim populations, who are, of course, by and large, supporting the Palestinian cause, or at least opposing the genocide, as one would expect. So there is certainly a strange convergence of far-right forces who have sort of discovered a late they had a sort of a late conversion to Zionism in this entirely opportunistic way. And this is a phenomenon that is visible across many European countries, in Italy, in Germany in the most dramatic way, given also the history of the country, of course, but also here in the Netherlands, we have this new far-right government just announced today, as Matthew was mentioning. And it is very sad to say that the public discourse at the moment is still quite dominated by this frame of sort of a largely imagined threat of anti-Semitism and a confusion of a sort of a political struggle with an issue of racism or discrimination that's sort of neither here nor there. The thing that is extremely hard to get across in Europe, it's something that's really elementary. It's a matter of dictionary definitions, namely that Zionism is not synonymous with Jewishness. I mean, there are, I think, only three types of people who believe that. Zionists, of course, anti-Semites, and people who are very, very confused. But it's just hard to get this simple point across. And so you have an abuse of all kinds of language around anti-Semitism, social safety, all kinds of concerns that have been raised in entirely spurious and pretextuous ways. But I want to say that there is a silver lining in this, or maybe I'm being optimistic here, but it is true that I think at least parts of the left, or even the liberal left, sometimes I like to say the putative left, they are beginning to realize that when they felt safe in trying to sort of curtail free expression in environments that they dominate, for example, universities, they now see that this can quickly get turned around them. They are rediscovering, on the left, there is a rediscovery of issues around free speech and academic freedom. And this is, I think, is quite promising, a rediscovery of the distinction between, feeling comfortable and actually being safe. These are very different things, and people are finally rediscovering this. And so I think, to end on an optimistic note, which is not directly, unfortunately, about sort of a path to a satisfactory resolution of the situation in Palestine, but at least in terms of how we can build a solidaristic movement across Europe and the United States in a way that will hopefully help for the solution. What I would like to at least sort of say something about my contained, perhaps small, but nonetheless, I think not insignificant optimism towards this sort of rediscovery of a traditional left value, right? Anyone with really even a cursory familiarity with the history of left politics knows that the powerful have the most to lose from ordinary people's ability to speak their mind freely, right? And that's something that we are being forced to rediscover, and I think this will be an important tool in the political struggle that we face to find a solution where everybody who lives between the river and the sea can live there with equal rights, and together with the people living there, we can, as Matthew and Jodi were saying before, we can create examples of how to build this more free and equal world that we are, as socialists, are striving towards. Thank you very much.
Hey, this is a very interesting discussion. I do not want to interrupt it for long with a big pitch. If you're watching this, you know what Red May does and what we bring to you. We have no institutional support. So if you want to support us, go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org. There's a donate button there. You can give us one-time contributions. Or if you want to support us on a subscription basis, we have our Patreon. And we also have a site called www.gofundme, where you can also give and take a break from capitalism. All right, I kind of screwed that up, but let's get on to the meat of the conversation here. I have three areas that I would like to open up for questions. Since it's Nakba Day, one of them is on Nakba. I'd like to ask about the question of violence and to what Jodi calls also the third area, the attempt to control what we can say and what we feel. So on my computer, I have a State Department report called Ethnic Cleansing in Kosovo, an accounting. And it's from 1999, the moment when the Kosovar Albanians were expelled by Serbs. The document that the US State Department did talks about tens of thousands of homes and at least 12,000 cities and villages have been damaged or destroyed. 90% of the population have been expelled. And if you were alive at that time, and that's what I'm really interested in, how it looked like from Europe, what it looked like to me was that I was watching the reenactment of the Nakba. But this time it was on the cover of Time magazine. You could see all these people, the Albanians who were carrying all their goods on their back, who were camped out outdoors in tents, who were being attended to by United Nations officials. Now, I don't know if you remember the ending of that particular process, but the United States ended up bombing the Serbs, and the Albanians eventually went back to their houses and to their country. The ending that didn't happen with the Palestinians. Anyway, the first thing I'm asking here is to see if you have memories of watching this and if you ever made that connection. And if the question I'm asking is, why do you think more Americans didn't look at that and think, oh, now I get it. Now I see what the Palestinians are talking about. Or am I being too optimistic about people's capacity to connect things?
Right, I think I should get this one. Yeah, of course, we have very vivid memories of what happened in Kosovo and before that, since we're very close, and also Greece is an Orthodox country, so the feelings of support to the Serbs were very strong. I'm not sure if I get the question, but I did remember this. For us on the left, there were multiple blackmails coming from different sides. So what do? The Serbs are massacring the Albanians. Then the NATO is bombing the Serbs. And so what would be like a position to keep and to take and keep it and hold it? And I mean, at least the groups that I was following came to the conclusion that when you're facing a blackmail of that proportion, of that kind, you just have to deal with the urgent needs. You cannot take a stable position because basically you're trapped between power formations that are either way not working for any good at all. So until you manage to actually change the story, change the narrative, what you must do is to advocate and fight for the one who's being victimized. So whether that will be the Albanians or the Serbs. I'm not sure if this contributes to the discussion, but
okay, so I guess basically
we'll be coming back to that again and again.
The analogy was simplified a much more complex conflict. And the visual resemblance between the two groups hid a great deal of difference. So I take that back then. And I'll move on to something which I know is much more relevant and has to do with the question of violence. Everybody probably remembers that scene in the Battle of Algiers where the FLN has just bombed a series of cafes, killing civilians, women and children, and there's a press conference. And the representative of the FLN says, look, we only use bombs because we don't have high tech. If you give us airplanes and bombs we could drop from them, we will be happy to do it if that's the right way to kill civilians. But since we're limited to what we can do to respond to you, we have to use the weapons we have. And that's essentially the argument that has been made again and again about asymmetric warfare by people who are fighting a larger enemy. Why has that argument disappeared, or why is it never answered? It seems that there is a good way to kill civilians, which is wholesale, and a bad way, which is retail, which is what what Hamas does. Is it the case that killing civilians is generally bad? And if that's the case, why is most of the animus directed at Hamas rather than Israel, which kills a far larger proportion, and not just after October 7th? So that's my question.
I'll come in on this. It's generally bad to kill civilians. Like, that shouldn't even be controversial, right? It's just generally bad. What happens, though, is that the oppressor or the hegemonic power is able to, as part of their hegemony, present the violence of the oppressed as somehow exceptional, or as worse, their own violence as an oppressor. And so it's just I think it's one of this asymmetrical conditions. I'm reminded of an interview that Angela Davis did when she was young and in prison, and the interviewer is asking her about violence, and does she accept violence or use violence, and she's just incredulous. She's like, what are you talking about? Right? I mean, I'm talking about a church in Birmingham where 4 little girls were killed by a bomb. I'm talking about the police state that's coming down here. Why are you asking me this? There's something like completely sort of disingenuous, particularly when we live in societies that are so dominated by violence, right? These enormous militaries. So I think you're right about the asymmetrical warfare aspect, and it goes further, right? It's the asymmetry in the ability to say that what one does is justifiable or not. I don't know if Enzo or Matthew would agree.
Yeah,
with
I
that.
might just want to come in on this. Just a small point. It's just that depending on the resources that, of course, I agree that one shouldn't target civilians. I mean, again, that's, I don't know how many people disagree with that. But the resources that one has at one's disposal make a big difference in how much one can claim to not be targeting civilians. I think many people, I hope many people will have heard about the lavender targeting system that the IDF uses. Are people familiar with this? Just to give a sort of a rough sense of what this is, it is an AI targeting system. And so it seems this was leaked by Israeli whistleblowers for a very good reason, because it is quite scandalous what this is, to put it mildly. It's a system that has a database of 37,000 individuals who are well, let's say, accused of being somehow members of Hamas, which is an implausibly high number to begin with. But in any case, so, it could be that there is, I don't know, 1 Hamas dude and 2 guys who were hanging out with him in the cafe. I don't know really how this works. But the point is that, starting from this database, the system generates a list of targets, and it tolerates something like 20 or so random civilian deaths for the sake of killing one of these alleged 37,000 Hamas members. And the human sort of operators who approve the targets, they barely have the time. I don't want to comment about the inclination, but in the way that the system is structured, they barely have the time to even review these targets. So they tend to just approve them. Now, this allows the IDF to claim that they are adhering to the letter of the classic distinction between intending and foreseeing, and they can call all these 20-odd people that are killed for every suspected Hamas person to be collateral damage. Well, they claim if these people hadn't been there, we also would have just tried to target the alleged operative, right? But the point is that, there is a level of low discernment or low discrimination between targets such that the effects are the same as hitting indiscriminately. I mean, this is before we even talk about all the various, children with, sniper shots to the head and various things that people have uncovered, right? We were talking about the official IDF narrative about their distinction between intending and foreseeing the killing of civilians. They say, no, we just foresee it. We don't intend it. It just happened to be in the way. But, if you have these resources, you're in a position to make that claim. But I think that what the whistleblowers have exposed is that to a large extent, this is in fact a fig leaf, because they have designed their own system in a way that generates these horrific amounts of horrific numbers of civilian casualties. I think something in the vicinity of 15,000 children that the last I checked. So yeah,
there's a very interesting response of de Gaulle's. The first German killed in occupied France was a naval cadet killed in the metro. The Germans then killed 75 workers as hostages. After this happened a number of times, where a huge number of people were killed in response to a few German officers being killed, de Gaulle went on the radio and said, we have the right to kill any German in the world because we're at war with them, and they're at war with us. They occupy us. But whether that's a good thing to do, given the overwhelming response that they can mount, is a question that we have to ask and use a certain amount of common sense. And he advocated then concentrating on killing French collaborators rather than killing Nazis, because that response wouldn't occur. So it just means that there's a way to separate, I think, what we call ethics from phronesis, and phronesis is coming up with the kind of practical thing. What's really going to happen if we do this? And do we want that to happen, and so forth? So I think yeah.
I think what also in this same vein, I mean, there's this de Gaulle example also makes me think a little bit about, how people understand like what counts as a civilian exactly. And a lot of it has to depend on like are settlers civilians? Does that count? Are occupiers civilians? Is a civilian any and if you've got guerrilla warfare or urban guerrilla warfare, how do you determine who is a civilian and who is not? So I think that it's actually not quite as easy as we sometimes think about it. And your de Gaulle example was like, okay, I guess so. There's no such thing really as a German civilian because they're at war with one another. So Matthew, you were nodding. I wonder if you wanted to.
I was just thinking that this is the first war after the split in Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia, that we have collective punishment openly. Like Israel is openly punishing Palestinians for supporting Hamas. It doesn't even hide it. And as Jodi said, it's pretty hard to distinguish between a settler, a non-settler who's using a parallel network to go to his village, which is normally up on the hill, and it's with a fence and an armor and a guard, than a civilian who lives there. How do you distinguish that? We have incidents all the time. But I would like to hear more, basically from Jodi and Enzo, maybe about this notion of collective or private punishment, because we did hear that from the States back in Yugoslavia, where they did try to, and then in Iraq as well, where they said they were trying to do like surgical strikes. And of course, we do remember that they were not surgical at all. From that point to the point where Israel is using AI machines to wipe out whole areas, the image that comes to my mind is that several wars by different imperialist forces, Russia included, in Grozny, for example, where whole cities were flattened to the ground. So I'm not even sure that it makes sense to not talk about collective punishment when it comes to war. But there are clear opinion.
What I was saying before is, in fact, that I mean, this talk about intending and foreseeing is largely a fig leaf. I think it's just not credible, and there should be more direct discussion of this point. I think it should be possible to contest this narrative, though it's hard, of course, in the legacy media to do this.
Yeah, I think surgical strikes are inherently bad faith narratives, claiming that AI or some other thing is going to allow us to separate it. But what I wanted to suggest, and I think Jodi was suggesting, is there is a whole range of alternatives between pacifism and some sort of massive retaliation, which real resistance movements think about when they're deciding what to make their next move and what will happen. So, but it's always to the interest of the occupier to portray them as indiscriminate killers and terrorists, as opposed to us who are, bleeding heart liberals or whatever, who take real care in who we kill.
So can I ask a question, Philip, or can I ask?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Good. I want to move to where I find the possibilities of hope, and that's in the movements, and to hear a little bit more because it's been very exciting in the U.S. So it's also been upsetting to see something like 2,000-3,000 students arrested and the encampment shut down, but the will and the spirit and the generosity. The kind of ecumenical solidarity in these encampments has been quite amazing. So I want to ask both Enzo and Matthew about their senses of the demonstrations and the movement. Let's maybe start with Enzo and then go to Matthew. That's good, because Amsterdam has been looking freaking 19th century, like crazy.
It's pretty big. So look, I didn't mean to, thank you, Jodi. I didn't mean to sound despondent when I said, yes, there is a lot of repression, but there is also a wave like we haven't seen for a very long time. And I'm not just talking about the campus movement, which is big, very big. I'm also talking about the city in general. We had on Sunday, we had well, it was a couple of days early, but because it was Sunday, it was a Nakba Day memo, which was enormous. Actually, I couldn't give you a number, but it was really, really very, I go to a lot of demos. It was really very big. It was attacked by a small number of far-right thugs, as was our encampment, the Gaza Solidarity encampment Monday last week, actually. Some of them came in, tried to set fire to it, then were chased away. But in general, there is a real overcoming of a taboo in speaking about these things. I think this is even more impressive, I think, in the US, for the reason that I was saying before, that despite the more entrenched freedom of speech, there is much more taboo and repression around Palestine in the US. But so there's certainly a taboo of fear has been broken there, and I think it has been broken here as well. And this is really quite hopeful. Despite now, I can talk about the university in particular. I hope, Matthew, that your daughter is okay. I don't know her, of course, but certainly many of our students have been arbitrarily sort of arrested, beaten by the police. There are debates about tactics. I'm not going to go into the details of who did what, etc. But in general, it's clear that there is really the university senior management, the administration, as you say in the US, they have been ruthless in just calling the riot cops on the first day on almost every occasion. And I think this, for now, is only galvanizing the movement. I mean, for every other demo, there are, at the demo to protest the previous eviction, there is yet a bigger crowd, and so on. And so, in that sense, we are in a good place when it comes to momentum, and we are hopeful, even though everyone is tired and a little bit scared, and so on and so forth. That's how it feels here, and I hear similar things from friends and colleagues also in other countries in Europe and in the US as well, and that strikes me as a real change relative to previous moments in which, well, this particular conflict flared up, or also other, sort of global level conflicts.
Yeah, I try to make the same point that the repression is galvanizing the movement, and maybe you see it, and I think that helps us, like this polarization will help the movement articulate at some point a goal, whether that will be a peace movement, a struggle against the far right that is marching in Europe. I don't know. But hopefully this will happen. And it will happen also because there was no real resistance. I mean, so what's happening in the US now in universities is actually very inspiring for what's happening in Europe. I mean, I think that especially the younger generations in Europe are listening very closely to what's happening with their peers in Columbia, the UCLA, and so on. And the kids in the US are really taking the lead, and it's so important. In Greece, where people are very tired after like 15 years of struggle with a crisis, a government that is presenting itself as a liberal one, but actually it's closer to the Tea Party, things are tough. I mean, after the split of Syriza broke like in 3 or 4 pieces. So the left now is again fragmented. Of course, Syriza was a front, it was a political front. It was not like a unified force. But this is also, again, helping. Today we had a huge demo not organized by the Communist Party, which traditionally scores low in elections but brings masses to the streets. The problem with the Communist Party of Greece, I'm not going to go into that, is sectarianism. It's not very happy to go with anyone else. It has like a very orthodox Leninist structure and culture, and it does go with that. So anybody else today went on the streets, and it was massive. It was massive. It was really, really hopeful. Now people were delayed, like they didn't go early enough in this. But I think the main reason is because on the political side, the left is fragmented now, and people are tired. But even this small resistance is meeting a huge repression. We had the prime minister himself saying that squats, occupations will not be allowed. I mean, this is a kind of it has been squats and occupations for like decades, and it's clear that they will use force in order to crack down the movement and also to polarize the far right audience. They're trying to keep it within the Conservative Party. There's a change in the balance of forces in the political system. The Conservatives are trying to create a far right that is legitimate, established, and balances the system with them being in the center. So that's what we're facing here. It's tough, but I think that what eventually will happen in Europe will affect us as well.
And there's a big effect, according to The Guardian, in Gaza. There's a video floating around of people being interviewed saying it's awe-inspiring what's happening on American campuses. And there are pictures of kids who made signs, thank you, Ohio State University, thank you, Harvard, thank you, UCLA. And what's interesting is the complete contrast between the response you're getting from Gaza and the centrist liberals who are being snippy and snarky about entitled kids, rich brats, and all that. The notion that we, or people on the campuses, and I think of them as a we because as an old 68er at Columbia, I feel part of this stuff when I see it, that these, that they're able to give some hope to people who have been abandoned by the world for so many years and bombed and submitted to kind of unimaginable travails, that you could do something that would bring a smile or something for a moment, seems to me great, regardless of what happens in the future. And let's talk about the future, where this is going. I mean, on the one hand, you have this opening up of this incredible, this explosion of finally a kind of Palestine solidarity that you feel should have been there years before. On the other hand, you have a candidate for president talking about a ferocious surge of anti-Semitism, where people are looking at a second McCarthy era and even worse here, and Jodi is experiencing it too in her own academic life. So the question is, how does one, how are these forces going to play out, and what's the best way to kind of even address the insanity when for years the taboo of talking about Palestine has created this well of ignorance where, the notion of the wave of anti-Semitism. Remember, it's not just that they're anti-Semitic acts, it's a wave that seems to be more dangerous than Islamophobia, even though 3 Palestinians were shot during this event and a kid was killed in Michigan or something, and nothing like that has happened yet to people who are uncomfortable on campuses. And or blacks and the shootings continue, and yet we're asked to believe that this one group is in more danger than the others. Is that something that the FBI statistics bear out, or are they accepting the Anti-Discrimination League as the only source of this?
I think those are complicated questions, Philip. One of the things that I've found really striking is it seems like, there's these far-right groups and far-right members of Congress who have been deeply connected with just straight up anti-Semitic groups, and they've empowered the anti-Semitic groups, and now they're using anti-Semitism as a way to crush everybody else. So it's like they're the anti-Semites who are now in the name of anti-Semitism or combating anti-Semitism, trying to stop like actually sort of much more diverse, pluralist, inclusive, and ecumenical movements. So it strikes me that until this, and I've been wondering about, is that the same thing in Europe, where is it a same phenomenon, or is it different? One is just a question. Then I also think that until the mainstream starts to grasp that, it's going to be difficult for there to be a mainstream change. I mean, we're getting a huge grassroots change, and that's really great, right? But I'm not sure on the mainstream part.
On the mainstream, I am a little bit something. It took me actually quite a long time to understand what was going on. So there's 2 things. One is that you have this completely opportunistic obsession about sort of imaginary anti-Semitism, and that's really, the European far right loves it because they love to hate Muslims. And here, especially for an American audience, it's worth remembering that from a class composition, especially the demographic of the European Muslim population is very different from the US one. It's usually a lower socioeconomic status individuals. So this lends itself to all kinds of stereotype, and that's just a straightforward thing. But this is the far right. But I'm talking even about the centrists in Europe, and this is that's straightforward, the far right. This is the thing that I've struggled with, and now I'm beginning to understand it. So there is this idea that it's extremely strong in Germany, but it's in many places in Western Europe. There is this idea that if you are a progressive, you will always support Israel. And I think the reason for that is that these people, they're barely past their own anti-Semitism. That it seems that, the progressive thing to do is to say something that is openly displays that they're not anti-Semitic, something like that, right? I mean, it doesn't even occur to them that to most people on the left, anti-Semitism is just such an alien thought that it wouldn't even occur to us, right? So they think, oh, if you have some problem with Israel, it must be anti-Semitism, because they genuinely think in their head that that's how everyone thinks, because they just, of course, they don't come from the tradition of anti-racism, of anti-colonialism, etc., right? And that's really a problem of the mainstream center, not even of the far right. It's peculiar. But that said, I do think that in the younger generation, and I see that, thanks to my job, of course, because I teach people in their early 20s, that there is a real shift in perceptions, and a real generational shift in Europe that's comparable to what we've seen also in the US, I think. And that's certainly a very hopeful sign, I think.
There are some questions from online, which you can take or not, about the one state versus the two state solution, or about the question of whether is the genocide in Gaza continuing primarily because Netanyahu wants to stay in office. These are things that can take a while to discuss, but
let's hear. Matthew was also about to say something.
No, I was just going to say that I like Enzo's phrase that basically the anti-Semites are the people who are supporting, were also the anti-Zionists. and now they've just found another. And that's also a challenge, I think, for, say, philosophy and politics, because these people will do hate politics one way or another. So now it's Islamophobia, and I also write it in my article that that's the main thing now for them. And tomorrow it could be again something else. It doesn't really matter. But the two-state, one-state solution, I do believe that although the one-state solution was a proposal of the left during the first Intifada, like that there could be like one state, like one democratic state that will facilitate all of them. Then that was abandoned. Then it came again from the Israeli side, and I think that nobody's taking that seriously anymore. Like until 6 months ago, everybody was convinced that now we're going to have one state, and it's going to be an apartheid, and we're going to have a civil movement, and we're going to talk about like the Palestinian rights. I think nobody believes that anymore. I think now people are convinced that either there will be two states or nothing. But of course, it's a very dynamic thing, and I think it could change again. But yeah, personally, I don't believe that the one-state solution is feasible anymore. I think it's completely out of the question. Yeah. What was the last question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Also, on your previous point, Matthew, I really liked a lot, like as you connected it with Enzo, it seems like there's a hatred of politics and a rejection of politics that's characteristic of the middle, which enables this collapsing of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, because the people who collapse them just don't think politically, and they don't think that other people think politically, and that it's part of this a kind of mainstream aversion to politics or the political. That's what I heard you arguing.
I think there's much room for a lot to be written and talked about there, right? I mean, it's this conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is monstrous. I mean, it's
yeah. And then the last thing, when on the one state, two state, one thing I've been wondering, as a activist, organizer, thinker on the left, is what if we started just perpetually displacing that question and saying that's up for the Palestinians and the Israelis? Actually, they're going to have to decide, right? The people who were there, and it doesn't need to be something that others need to decide. Like, I don't know, like I sometimes feel like it's meant as a litmus test. I don't think you answered it that way, of course, Matthew, but I've been wondering about just saying, like, that's not the most, like, the biggest discussion is, ending genocide, ending occupation, beginning a peace process, building or supporting the Palestinian political process that can be capable of having this discussion and recognized as the party in this discussion, something like that. I'm not saying this very well, but it's ways to try to not think that thinking politically means that you have to construct your answer in terms of one or two states as the horizon.
Yeah, I like what Jodi just said now. And I'm reminded a little bit of something that Marx said, that we don't write recipes for the cook shops, right? And I think there's.
Yeah, I was just trying to be journalistic and pragmatic. I'm sorry.
No, but look, I think the pragmatic stuff is also important, and I think the dichotomy between one and two states can also be false. I mean, you can have an idea where a two-state solution is not, however, the definitive sort of arrangement, and it's a step onto something else. So I don't think that these things necessarily are incompatible with each other, right? I think what's important, is to give some general parameters. I mean, I think as socialists, I think we'd agree that the idea is that all of the people who live now between the river and the sea should be able to live there, that there should also be a version of the right of return that is acceptable to the Palestinians, and that then the coexistence of all of these people should be made possible in some way that this then leads to stability in the region. And there are many different ways. There are discussions about a confederation rather than one or two states, that something else that people have been discussing, and there are many other things. But the important thing is, what do we want? We want these people to be able to live there in peace, all of them who are there now, and some version of the right of return. And that includes the Jews, the Arabs, with all the differences between them, the Druze, and all the other people who live there. I think that's the solution. I mean, that's the goal, rather.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I just don't see with so much blame right now who will be the agents for that. But yes, you're totally right. That should be the goal, no doubt.
We have to remember, too, that every proposal that's been presented to the Palestinians has been something designed for them by someone else. The attempt is to include them in a peace process that they really have no voice in developing. So it's very important that we get the Israelis to finally talk to the Palestinians instead of talk through Americans and whatever. We could go on. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we will have more, hopefully, and we wish the best to all of you in your ventures, and Jodi, in your struggle, and the encampments go on and build into something. I guess I should quickly tell you what's coming up in Red May tomorrow, which is Thursday at 10 a.m. Samuel Chambers has written a wonderful book called Money Has No Value. And he's going to talk about it with Beverly Best and Patrick Murray. So this is really heavyweight stuff on money. On Friday at 5 p.m., Red May is premiering its news program, Red May News Jam, with the first program called 1, 2, 3, Many Columbias. We're going to have correspondents from UCLA, USC, NYU, and so forth, reporting on what's happening there. I mean, some things that are happening are really incredible. I found out this morning that at NYU, students have to write reflective pieces in order for them to get in. The next thing, they're going to be sent down to rural areas to be rehabilitated. I don't know what's going on, but it's absolutely bizarre. Anyway, thanks for coming, and thank you, Jodi, for putting this together. Enzo and Matthew, nice to meet you guys. Hope we'll see you back again. Kyle, you can cut us out. I just want to...
Thank you very much for having us, and Jodi, good luck with...
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Very
Y'all
much.
Get some sleep. Thanks for being on
Yes.
so late.
Jodi, I have one thing for you before when we cut out.